Hello, this is Christopher Burdett, and I'm going to be walking you through a painting of a couple monsters battling. On the screen right now is the digital sketch that I did. Just kind of figuring out the idea, shot a little bit of reference, and then got started on the sketch. And now here is the final drawing. Zoom in to have a look. I work with black colored pencils on marker paper for these. Start digital, then went to traditional. I take the drawing into Photoshop, split it into two duplicate layers. The bottom layer I reduce to 21% opacity and add a 4 pixel Gaussian blur. And then the top layer, the top duplicate layer, I reduce about a 49% opacity. And I take both those layers and merge them together and add a 4 pixel median noise filter. And basically what this does is it takes my tight line drawing and turns it into grays and gradients and just kind of softens everything. You can see the difference in the drawing and then the process drawing. And it just gives me something better to paint on top of. I'll talk more about that later. The next step I do is I add a new layer. It's a multiply layer set, and I add a medium gray to it. And then another new layer on top of that, set to soft light and 60% opacity. I just start going in with black and white and grays and start building up the value range of the piece, just kind of knocking in the darks and lights. This is done really fast. Actually, not as fast as you see it here. I've now sped up to about 4 times normal speed. So it's about at 400% speed. But I'm going in real fast and loose in the scheme of things. Just kind of working up what I imagine the darks and the lights being on this piece. I've figured out that I'll probably have a general above in front of light source. So they're going to be top lit with the focus on the 2 monster faces and the big tentacle creature that's about ready to snap at the left giant head. But as you see, going in real fast, real loose, not worrying about detail, not worrying about sticking to all the lines. I usually paint the majority of the painting with being able to see the entire image all at once on my screen. It just helps me not focus on one area too much and kind of build up the entire piece. I'll also be going into that at further detail soon. But right now we're just blocking in some of the lights now. Just kind of figure out where the light's going to be hitting and what bits are going to be shiny and bright, and what parts are going to be in shadow. At this point, it's not really worrying about being 100% accurate or correct. It's just about getting some darks and lights down because the rest of the painting is going to be built on top of these values. Layer after layer, the painting kind of just comes together. And just kind of throwing in some medium grays in the background. Because I'm working at a 60% opacity rate on this layer, it allows me, it prevents me from getting too dark or too light in any one place yet. I'll save those decisions for later in the painting. At this point, I've actually gotten a little bit tighter, just kind of playing in some of the more smaller masses. You know, you want to work big, from big to small, and as you saw originally, I had my brush pretty large, and I was mapping out really large areas of dark and then areas of light. And at this point, I've now shrunk my brush a little bit and starting to play up some of the smaller forms within the larger forms. And if you don't work large to small like that, you have a tendency to break up the uniformity of some of your masses and your shapes. And because it doesn't matter if you get every wrinkle and every fold correct on that tentacle, if the overall structure, the form of that tentacle isn't accurate, you're wasting your time. I've now actually switched over to one of my main texture brush. It has a jitter with the opacity, I think it's opacity, value, and color jitter between the foreground and background colors. So it kind of plays off of those two. So I picked two different grays, or sometimes I'll pick black and white and go back in with the texture brush. And it just kind of picks values and colors between the foreground and background color, and just gives me a really nice scatter and unexpected happenings. Since I'm only working black and white here, it just gives me a nice variation of values of between black and white. Now that I went in with the texture brush and kind of muddied things up, I'm going back in with my normal brush, my chisel brush, and just kind of knocking stuff back and bringing stuff forward, just laying the shadows back in and some of the highlights back in if they were basically affected too much by the texture brush. And it's about going in layer after layer. Oh, okay. Move to the next step already. I'm moving faster than I thought. This is a layer adjustment. So on a new layer, I add a gradient map, and I reduce the layer to 60%. As you can see, I'm picking a deep red and a bright green, and it just kind of gives the entire piece a real nice color value to start off of. These images that are flying on the screen right now, these are pictures that I took in our garden. Since I'm doing a red-green complementary painting, I decided to go out into the yard and take a bunch of photos of red and green plants to pull from. I'm now officially working on my underpainting, or what I consider my underpainting, the color. It's a hard light layer, as I created a new layer and set it to hard light. And this layer predominantly just gets color and saturation. So if you throw down a red, it's going to be a really, really saturated red. And if you throw down a very muted color, it lays down a lot softer. And it's just, for the most part, this layer, hard light, handles color really nicely when it's going over like a value steady. I find it works much better than, say, like an overlay layer. But again, I'm still at this point, I'm working very fast, very loose. I didn't like that initial green that I picked for the tentacle, so I'm going back in with something a little deeper, a little warmer. But I mean, it's coming together really, really fast. And at this point of the painting, things move really quickly. Always pulling from reds and greens, even the sky and the water. But the reason why I chose red and green is that there is a lot of red and green in nature and in the world around us. And I find that pulling from believable real world resources and for reference is one of the best ways to go about making believable, fantastical imagery. So pulling from the real world really strengthens anything imaginary that you're going to create. Let's see, I'm still just dancing around the image. I'm starting to get a little bit darker. I'm not, especially with the way this file is set up now with a value steady and going now in with just color, I can concentrate on just laying down local colors and that I'm happy with. A lot of the value work has already been done. Yes, I'm going in with darkers here, but darker colors here, but the foundation's already there. I have a nice solid line drawing that's been turned into some grays that already are now blending with the paint work that I'm already starting to lay down. As you can see, I'm actually going in with a green into the red, and I was previously working with reds into the greens. This really helps tie everything that I'm doing together. Because if I had a bright red creature that's just red, fighting a bright green creature that was really green, it would be the Monster Christmas special. But, pulling from these realistic colors that I have photo reference of, I can just build up something that's not going to be super Christmassy, and it's going to be just something more believable. And if I'm mixing the colors together, everything's just, there's a lot more cohesiveness, and there's just a lot more, well, there's less local color, basically. Because if there was just a red object that was just red and a green object that was just green, and there was no play between them and no environmental light on them, environmental color on them, they would feel very odd and very isolated. And I see that with a lot of young artists, and I fought this for a long time, and maybe I still fight this now. But you'll look at the work, and if something's red, it's red. And it's completely red. Red highlights, red shadows, red local color. If it's next to another object, it's still red. It's not, there's no bounce light, there's no bounce color on it or on the other things. And the world in color and light is this really big, complex, crazy thing. And if you don't mix everything together and have them playing off of each other, it feels very isolated and segmented. And by working the colors together and picking lots of colors, it really helps build up a more believable form and image. Because, I mean, even with these shadows, they're not black. Black is a killer on paintings. You really shouldn't use black. It just really flattens things out, especially if you're a young artist and you're starting out and you think to yourself, well, there's a shadow there. I got to get out my black paint, or I got to pick black from the color pickers. No, no, no. Until you're experienced and know what you're doing, black can really ruin a painting. And all of the shadows, all of the darker areas, they're dark values of color. They're dark reds, they're dark greens. And, you know, shadows can be yellow, shadows can be blue, but just, you know, they can be a dark value. As long as the value is correct, the shadow can be any color, and it should be a color. So on this particular piece, generally speaking, the shadows on the red creature are going to be green, and the shadows on the green creature are going to be red. And then this just kind of, yet again, builds off the cohesiveness, and also begins to play up the fact that there's green light bouncing onto the red creature, and then there's red light bouncing onto the green creature. And yet again, I keep saying it has this cohesiveness, this synergy that just pulls it all together. And I hope you notice too that as I'm working, I'm constantly moving around and moving around the canvas. I'm not concentrating on any one area or one element too much. I'm just building up the entire piece. And this is just a good way to make sure that the painting is coming together at the same rate, that all the areas are being addressed, that you're not overworking one area and then underworking another area, because that can be a really big problem where you have an area that's super overworked and you've like spent all this time working on one area, and then you realize, well, I now have to do that to everything else. So if I had just spent a ton of time just rendering out one section of that tentacle, I would have to now do it again and again and again and again for each tentacle. But if I build them up together all at the same time, they're all have a similar treatment, they're all handled the same way, and they'll feel the same way. Alrighty, after putting in some highlights, it looks like it's now time to get started on some actual opaque paintwork. Now that the underpainting is done, I've just made a new normal layer, and I'm going in with my main brush, my vertical chisel brush, and I'm just starting to lay in the background. I usually work back to front. I find that it's a lot easier to knock out the background first, because the background, generally speaking, is going to be looser, and it's going to be a lower contrast, because as you move from things far away to close, the closer the foreground is darker generally, brighter generally, and has a higher contrast. As you move away, one of the ways to show perspective, not to, besides atmospheric perspective, where things kind of blue out, turn blue as they get further away. It's to lower the contrast and lower the complexity of your objects, and that really tends to push things back. And right now I'm just I'm doing a lot of brush work, but it's to imply rather than to render. It just needs to feel like a forest. It doesn't have to look exactly like a forest, because those trees, those branches, those trunks, those limbs back there are not the focus of this piece. The focus of this piece is the monster, and it's the monster's head. And so anything that I do in the background, it needs to not pull focus from the foreground. And I'll need to address controlling the focus in a moment, but I'm just laying in very similar values, very similar colors, and just like I said, implying the forest. Darks, lights next to each other, just dancing around, keep things moving, keep things light, just keep working the entire piece up all together. I'm not going to get in there and render out one of those trees to its entirety all at once. A waste of my time at this point. I will revisit areas of the background throughout this painting, but for now, it's good enough just to kind of bring up some of the shapes, bring up some of the forms, add in a little bit of detail, only enough where it's needed. As I work on the foreground, I'll get a better understanding of what I would need to do with the background. Because sometimes I'll realize things are too dark, things are too bright, things are too high of contrast, too low of contrast, not enough detail. And that's why I work back to forward. Because if I had done all the work on the figures first, for one thing, I would feel done with the painting, because I'd done all of this tight rendering on the figures, and then I'd have to paint around them to put in the background. At this stage of the game, if I make stray marks and paint over a horn or get too much onto the tentacle, it doesn't really matter. I'm going to be painting those figures again later, and I can clean up those edges a lot easier than trying to paint the background into the edges. And I'm starting to put up a little bit more form in the splashing water. Starting to play things up. That's technically still the background. I think I'm going to move on to the water in the foreground, but it's still less important elements. Just starting to build up some of the areas, get a feel for things. So let's talk about directing the focus of the viewer. I talk a little bit more. I talk at length a little bit in the written portion of this, but basically it's your job as an artist to show the viewer who the star of your painting is. Your illustration, your drawing, whatever it is. Generally speaking, unless it's this big sweeping landscape or a concept piece where it's all about the entire piece, you're going to have a focal point. For me, the focal point in this piece is the left head of the giant and the snarling tentacle maw that's about ready to clamp on to his face. To bring emphasis to that, I am going to be rendering it. Oh, I just just to jump again. I was showing what the background was on and off. I'm now created a new layer, and I'm starting to go in and render on the figures. I zoom in real quick to just do some cleanup on the face, but I'm going to move back out and start working up the figures. Okay, making sure that I'm still in reds and greens. Here I go. Back to focus. So the tentacles all point up to the face. The fingers point to the face. The curve of the arm into the shoulder, into the right head, leads up into the face. The bony protrusions and the teeth and the little tendrils of the mouth of the creature point to the face. The water points to the face. I try to make sure that there's elements direct in the eye, orthogonals in the image that direct the eye, focus the eye to where you want the viewer to look. And as humans, when we look at things, we focus on hands and faces anyway. So not only are you going to probably be putting more attention on your hands and faces, it helps to have other elements directing the viewer to them. It's just the way we are as people, as visual animals. We look to faces, and then we also look to hands. So you try to make sure, if that's the focus of the piece, you want to make sure other elements in the image are helping direct the eye. If the tentacles were all pointing off into random other directions and away from the face, it would lead the eye away from the face. And you don't have to hit the viewer over the head, but it helps to direct them. All right, and as you can see, I'm still moving around. I am putting a little bit more emphasis on the top head of this tentacle monster, but like I said, it's the head, or what constitutes as a head for a tentacle monster. And I'm just starting to build up some of the color choices, some of the value choices I would like to pick, how bright I want to make this thing. Kind of working things out. And once I kind of get an idea what I want to do, I'll begin to then incorporate that to the rest of the creature. And it's all about, like I said, wave after wave after wave of work and detail, and just treating it as an entire image over and over and over again. Just kind of making sure that no one area gets too much work, or not, you don't want to pull out any stars just yet. When it comes time to start focusing on the faces, then you'll really want to start putting some time and effort to tightly render, and then the rest of the piece can then be reflected off of the work that you do on the head. Let's talk about some of my brush choices. At this stage of the game, after a number of years of working, I've kind of narrowed my brush selections down into about 5 different brushes. And this is over many years of just trial and error, trying out new things, seeing what works and what doesn't work. I used to use a ton of brushes, and it was all well and good, but I find the less is more is always a good idiom to live by. And over the years, I've just kind of narrowed it down to a few brushes, and really ultimately I've narrowed it down to one brush, and the brush that's included with this workshop, my vertical chisel brush, is what I paint 95% of my painting with. One brush, and just me making marks with that brush. And I've been pretty much exclusively painting with it for the last 3 or 4 years. Actually, it might even be longer than that at this point, but it's just my go-to brush. It makes a really nice, realistic, naturalistic mark. It has a lot of texture to it. I can make it really, really large and brush with it really lightly on my canvas, because it has an opacity jitter based on pin pressure. And I can make these really weird, big textural marks, or I can tighten it down very, very, very small and get really precise, really clean line work. And for me, that's a win-win. It's loose and it's tight, and depending on the pressure, I can get a lot of different effects. And it's been my brush for a number of years now, and I've made a lot of paintings with this brush. I used to have a dozen brushes, and I would go back and forth. And for a while there, I was early on in my career, I was using a soft round with an opacity jitter, and all of my work was soft and round. And it was, it was fuzzy and muddy, and there was no hard edges, and everything was kind of bland. And eventually at some point I switched to a hard edge round, and everything kind of had blobby, bubbly transitions. And it took a lot of passes and a lot of passes and a lot of passes to get something down. And eventually I came to this brush, and it's never done me wrong. Take a break from brushes real quick. As you can see, I'm starting to get a little tighter in some of the forms. I've blocked out the general overall volume of the tentacles, and now I'm making sure to put in a good, nice core shadow as it turns from the light side to the dark side, and starting to put in some bounce lights, starting to play up some of the smaller forms, and just, slowly tightening things up. And but as you can see, I'm still, working on a piece that's about 9 by 12, but I can see the entire piece on screen. So I'm not working that tight yet. But in the scheme of things, as I've been working so far, I am tightening it up. And it's, as I've said, again and again, it's wave after wave after wave of detail and attention and brushwork. It gets tighter and tighter and tighter, and the piece starts to come together. And it's about painting things in, painting over them, not liking them, changing them, getting a feel for what works, starting to play up edges, adding additional detail, adding bounce light, and it's just wave after wave. And as you can see right now, I'm addressing one of the issues that I had that I realized while I was working. That splash there just didn't look right. So I'm going in and brushing it out. It just kind of had it just didn't look, it just didn't look right. And so I felt that it needed to get rid of it and make sure that it was splashing up more towards the face of the creature and did its job as an orthogonal directing the eye in the piece. So yeah, where was I? Brushes, that's right. So I have my main chisel brush that I do most of my work with. Besides that, I have a couple different texture and scatter brushes, and they're all included in this workshop as well. The main one is a scattering texture brush, and it's just this crazy big pattern, and you've already probably seen it used a couple of times. I use it for a lot of just crazy breakup and texture. And it has some very nice jitters set to it, so as you brush, it spirals and flips around the pattern, as well as playing with your foreground and background color choices. And this gives me a lot of happy accidents with a painting, because it'll generate sometimes some really crazy colors in kind of this scattery noise texture, so that I can then play off of some of this randomness and bring some of those colors back into a piece. Because sometimes I'll be painting something with some greens and reds and browns and yellows, and I'll be using this brush and it'll throw out this crazy turquoise. And that turquoise, I would never have thought about it necessarily on my own. But once it's down and I begin to work it into the piece, it's brilliant. And it's things like that that have taught me how better ways to use color. And so I began to think about where I could throw down a crazy turquoise or an unexpected yellow. It's from these happy accidents, and it's really like a learning process the entire time. Besides that scatter texture brush, there's a spotty brush. I made that brush when I was working on a painting for Dungeons and Dragons back in 2008. I needed some exploding dirt and debris, and trying to paint it by hand just came out a little too on the nose and a little too predictable. So I built this brush to kind of make this crazy splatter effect, and that brush has been with me ever since. And I sometimes use it in rather unexpected ways, and sometimes it's still just used for splatter and action and kind of craziness. And also there's the drop brush, and that's basically, it's a modified spotty brush, and it's just for water and magic and just a more uniformed texture. So I'm still working at it. I'm still painting away, painting away. You'll sometimes see that I'll put down, like, I write what was happening between the two monsters' faces. I was putting down a bright color and then removing it, and laying down another color and removing it. What I was doing was taking a bright value and brushing it down semi-opaquely, and then selecting that color and undoing the mark, and going in again with that new color that's kind of a combination of the one that I picked with the color picker and the background. And it just helps make better transitions, kind of soften my color choices. Because sometimes, sometimes you just don't pick the right color right away, and you need to play with it a little and work it into the background to see, to get actually what you intended and need. And I'm still dancing around the painting, adding detail, wave after wave of passive, playing up the form, finding edges, adding detail. In many ways, I think about paintings as being an analogous to a road trip, a car trip, especially a long car trip, because when you have to drive for 12 hours, there's really no way to rush that. You are going to be in the car for 12 hours. You could drive fast, and you run the risk of a speeding ticket or an accident, or any number of bad things can happen. So you might as well go at the correct pace and just sit back and enjoy the ride and get the most out of it. And sometimes a lot of times I feel that way about painting. Painting is going to take as long as it's going to take. And sometimes a car trip and sometimes a painting go really quickly. You don't have to go that far. And sometimes you have to go extra far. So I kind of sit back, and I know that as long as I keep with it and follow all of my steps and put the amount of attention and effort into it, that I will get to this end of the road trip and I'll have a complete painting. Because there's no point on rushing it. Yes, sometimes you have deadlines. Yes, sometimes you don't have the freedom to do everything that you need to do or want to do, or have the time to work on the painting, and you have to rush things. But I find that if I rush, I run the risk of making mistakes. So if I just sit back and enjoy the ride, enjoy the painting, and put the time in, I'll be much happier with what I end up with. That's my 2 cents on my great philosophy of painting, the great car trip. And I'm painting. Really exciting stuff, I'm sure. Hopefully you're getting a lot out of this. It's sometimes weird to watch myself work objectively, because I think to myself, wow, I'm just all over the place at once, completely scatterbrained with painting. But I mean, that's really is what this moving around has really helped me speed up my painting process and to get better at what I'm doing and make sure that my paintings have a lot more cohesion. Because when I first started working, it took me a long time to paint. Oh, let's jump back in real quick. I'm starting to put some rim light into things. Rim light is a double-edged sword. Rim light is great and awesome and fun and cool, and it makes things look neat, and it really helps break up the figure from the background. But you got to be careful and you got to be smart. I think you'll see in like the hand and the wrist, I start to pull some of that rim lighting into the form, where additional textures on the form start to catch some of that light, and the marks curve into the form. It's not simply an outline. It follows contours and edges and cuts into the shape that it's backlit. Take some photos of yourself backlit as well as front lit, and you can see how the light cuts into the form. And you'll actually see when I zoom in and start working on the face, you'll see the rim lighting in my reference and the rim lighting I put on the faces. And I'll talk further about what I'm doing. Let's see, where was I? And I'm painting and I'm painting. Fun stuff. I was talking about the time it takes to paint. Yeah, so this piece, from start to finish, just the painting, just from when I had my drawing in Photoshop, my finished drawing, it took me 6 hours and 45 minutes to complete. If you want to tack on the digital sketch, shooting reference, doing the drawing, it's probably another 2 hours and 15 minutes. Let's, to get the additional work done. So this piece, from start to finish, 9 hours, more or less, from start to finish. A painting much less complicated, much smaller, much more straightforward, much simpler, earlier in my career, took me days and days and days. So I get a little frustrated sometimes when a young artist comes up and asks, how long did it take to make this painting? Because that's kind of irrelevant, because for everybody, it's a different speed, and and also during your progression as an artist, it will take you a different length of time to make a painting. So 8 years ago, it took me forever to make a fully rendered color piece, and it would have been nothing like this. It was much simpler, much more straightforward, probably like an isolated figure on a white background. And it would just take me a very, very long time. I mean, I can do something similar, an isolated figure on a white background, depending on the piece. I can paint it in a couple hours. But that's because I've been painting constantly for years now. So, and I used to beat myself up early on in my career about not being fast enough, trying to be faster. And I should have just took that time that I was worried about not being fast enough and just painted. Because getting faster, like getting better, takes time and hard work. That's the catch-22 and the thing no one wants to hear. It's like, how do you get better? lots of time and hard work. And there's no shortcut to the time and hard work thing. Sadly, there just isn't. And there will always be people that are younger than you or your same age or older than you. There will always be people that are faster and better. And there'll be people who will pick this stuff up quicker and easier. And there's nothing you can do about it. And there's nothing you need to worry about it. There's no point in worrying. Okay, real quick, what I'm doing is, as you can see, I'm starting to put bounce light into some of the shadows. I'm putting greens up into the reds and reds down into the greens. And this just makes a much more dynamic, fully formed volume. Because now, say with the hand, you have the front of the hand, the knuckles, the fingers, they're being fully lit by the light source. So that's like the front, the top, the side, whatever. And as it wraps over towards the thumb, there's shadow from the tentacle, and there's it's moving away from the light source. And underneath, it's turning away from the light source and into shadow. Now, if that was just black, or if that was just dark, dark, dark red, it would be really, really flat. But now that it goes brightly lit and it goes to dark, that there's that bit of coarse shadow right at that edge where it turns from light to shadow. You still have that dark, but then as it moves away and it's being affected by the light hitting the green tentacle, the green, slimy, shiny tentacle, the light hits that surface. If it was a real object, hits that surface and bounces up under the hand into the shadow. And you'll have a green cast to that shadow. And having that in there and having those types of variations in the light and darks of the forms greatly, greatly, greatly improves the believability and the realism, the natural feel of these forms. I mean, that's a fantastical, crazy, big, giant hand. But you can look at it and go, I see what the anatomy is doing. I know what that is. That is a hand, and the tentacle is bending over and up into its grasp, and the hand's turning under, and there's light, green light bouncing up. It just works better. And it's just a much more naturalistic, realistic form. And it's little things like that, because I didn't know these things to begin with. You know, I got out my black, and I would have just filled that in all day long with black or really, 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 really dark. And I'd been so happy with myself because it was black, because shadows are black. And I was wrong. And it just took time and hard work to learn the errors of my ways. And I looked to my peers and looked to my mentors and got on the internet and asked people questions. And I looked at magazines and tutorials, and I went to programs that did instruction, and I learned, and I made a lot of mistakes. And that's how these things go. And I'm painting and I'm painting and I'm painting. Still just moving around, not getting too focused on anywhere. You know, just kind of building things up. Trying to see what works and what doesn't work. And I think it's working. Mostly. Like I said, it's that car trip. Slowly but surely. Hopefully you're not too done with hearing my voice just yet. there's a bit more to go on this tutorial. And hopefully along the way I'll share some bit of wisdom and knowledge. You could always mute me and just watch the pretty pictures. Of course, hopefully I'm offering up some good advice. Well, I'm starting to go in and build up some of the water now, starting to just play with some of the dynamic elements. A lot of the really crazy stuff I'll save to the very, very, very end, because you never know what's going to happen, and you could spend all this time doing some crazy magic effect and then realize that it's just all wrong, and then you've painted it into your painting 3 layers ago, and you have no way of controlling it now. But working. It should be noted that my drawing is still very much a part of the image that you see. Later on, I'm going to zoom in and turn the drawing off and on so you can see exactly how much it actually is still affecting things. It's because I turned the drawing into the gray tones, the value that I did, it really quickly and easily meshes with my brushwork. My painting would not exist without my drawing, but more on that later. As you can see, I'm starting to get tighter and tighter, adding lots of nice scales and spots and wrinkles. The reason why I've built up my workflow, one of the reasons I've built my workflow up the way I have, is that early on, I would want to paint all the scales, all the wrinkles, all the teeth, all the detail first. That's the stuff I love, and it's the stuff that I would add at the very beginning. And it was killing me. It was really, really killing my work. And because my piece wouldn't have any focus and cohesiveness, there's that word again, it would just be this flat layer of disconnected texture. And it took a long time for me to backtrack and back up and step away and learn to build up the forms first and know that all of that detail will be waiting for me later in the painting. And it took a long time. It took a very long time to get there, to understand what I needed to do and how I needed to go about creating these paintings. And I'm starting to play up some of that back, a lot of that bounced light, throwing some texture in there as well. Always trying to pull greens into the reds and reds into the greens. It just really, to me at least, it looks right. And as an artist, there's this fine line between what is right and what looks right. And ultimately, what looks right is what's going to win. I've had some problems with some reference over the years where I made my drawing and my painting like the reference. And it was wrong. It was right in the photo, but it was wrong in the painting. And I had to learn to disconnect myself from the reference at some point and paint what looked right. Now, reference is important, and I'll talk about reference shortly, but you need to have a certain objectivity to some of these things. Namely, it was a piece I was doing of a dead elf, and his hand was laying on the ground next to his head, and it was foreshortened and coming at the viewer. And I was looking at my reference to paint the thumb, and I painted it and drew it just like the reference. But at some point in the painting, it stopped looking like a thumb and started looking like something else. And thankfully, my wife stopped me and made me change it and made me see what I was doing. And I changed the position of the hand and repainted the hand in such a way that the thumb wasn't coming at the viewer that way and didn't look questionable. But, you know, it just takes time to learn these things. You know, throughout this entire process, I'm still pulling color from my reference, pulling naturalistic, realistic colors from the real world, and which is really one of the reasons why I picked red and green for this workshop, is because the colors of the rainbow exist in nature, but red and green are all over the place, and they're very natural, organic, real colors. There's not really many big blue plants and big yellow animals, bright yellow, I'm saying. There's no like purple animals, big bright purple giraffes, big purple elephants, no. But there's lots of great big green frogs and big red salamanders, and plants with magenta and fuchsia centers with green tips, and lots of lovely green plants and red foliage. There's plenty of real world reds and greens that I can pull from to make a believable, interesting piece. I mean, yes, I could have done this with yellow and violet, but I would have been fighting those colors the entire way and been making them very muted and very desaturated, because, you know, I feel at least I can get away with a big red two-headed giant rather than a big purple two-headed giant. But I'm moving around. Oh, something might be happening. Oh, look, it's a monster. Now it's time to start working on the face. I'm starting to pull some rim line in. As you can see, look at the rim line on the monster reference face. Look at the end of the nose, how the light wraps around the edge of the nose and it coats the plane of the nose that faces that back light source. And it's ever so thin in the photograph, but it's very important to see what I'm doing now with the painting is I'm adding that dark shadow, that core shadow between the light side and the rim light. You need to have that area where it goes dark, or it begins to it just begins to look weird. It begins to look like the object is being, it's two colors, or it just doesn't look right. You need to make sure that you see the fold of the form go to dark before the rim light. And I'm just now going in, now that I'm working on the star of this painting, I'm looking at my reference, looking at the different planes of the face, and I'm going in and using what I've already put down color-wise and value-wise. I'm just playing things up. I'm starting to go much brighter, and I'm starting to go a little darker, and I'm just cleaning up the face, adding teeth and shadow, and just really defining things, because ultimately the viewer is going to look right at those faces, and if the faces aren't fully rendered and fully dealt with, you're going to, you know, waste a lot of your time and energy. You know, you want to really focus your energy, and your stars of your painting need to have that energy put into them. But as you can see, you know, look in the shadows. Look at the shadows of the face. They go to green. And is that right? I mean, I don't see green in my face in the photo. I mean, the monster's face in the photo reference, but it just, you know, in this green-red world of my painting, looks and feels right. And it just, for me, it looks good. And I'm sure there's someone who can, on a scientific level, on a like earth science level, say yes, it's because, you know, when you're dealing with this type of light source and this type of thing that, you know, it's, there's a reason why. But having the complexity of color and value and form just make for a much more interesting, complex, dynamic, naturalistic form. I mean, look at the. I haven't done a ton of work on this face up until now, and I haven't necessarily done a lot of work now. But I'm looking at the reference. But I mean, already you pull back and look, that face. That face is way more put together now. It has a lot more form, and you know, I've done my work close up, and now I've pulled back, and I'm just, you know, making sure that on the grander scheme of things, that the face still works. And now I begin to put more attention and detail around the head. Now that I've put all that tight detail in, it's now time to, you know, make sure it works. And that's, you know, now blending it in layer after layer after layer also helps just bring up the entire detail level of the entire piece. You know, and I've done some work on the head, and now it's time to move around the piece a little bit more, putting in additional brighter areas and darker areas and defining the edges and forms. Just keeping at it, layer after layer. Not to sound like a broken record, but see, and I just went back to the background in response to what I just did. I knocked the background back some. Getting just a good look at it, and then I get in, pull in tight again, and then start to bump up brightness, define the forms a little bit more, explain how they're catching the light. I know some painters that wait a little bit longer to put some of the brights in, but you know, I think when I'm working on the star of the piece, that it's best to define the full range of value. Well, let's take a look at the hand now. I'm working on the hand, so I better look at my hand reference. It might not be as perfect a reference for what I need, but it's pretty darn close, and it just helps with some of the wrinkles, the folds. And ultimately, that's what it is about reference. And I harp on reference a lot when I talk to young artists and when I talk about my work. Reference is so very important. And so many young artists, and I was completely guilty of this, just don't use reference. There's this weird misbelief, disconnect, that somehow you have to be able to pull everything from your head. And if you don't, if you don't pull things from your head, if you don't naturally have all of these things just spring forth from your imagination, that you're somehow not a good artist or not as good as an artist. And that is completely wrong. So wrong. Reference empowers imagination. I get so many better ideas and so many stronger ideas from looking at real world things and then creating off of them. If you want to make a really good reptile monster, look at some reptiles, understand how they work. If you don't, you're just going to be pulling weird, random, abstract things out of your head, and they're going to be wrong. Unless you've painted a crocodile 1,000 times, and you know crocodiles like the back of your hand, then I'll trust that you can pull a crocodile monster out of your imagination. But until that point, until you've done 1,000 crocodiles, you're going to need to look at some crocodile reference when you're trying to do a big, scaly, aquatic reptile monster, or you know, any kind of monster. Look at animals. Look at animals when you're doing monsters. It's amazing the information that's there. Basically, reference is not cheating. Reference makes better work, and you need to be using reference. No one can realistically and effectively paint people out of their head unless they've been doing it all their lives. Well, it's time to move on to the other monster head, and thankfully, I have at all times an excellent monster model to work from. He's always on call and available. And now, you know, I'm starting to pull some of my color choices from one head and start working them into the other head, so there's some cohesiveness. I mean, granted, the model does not have horns, but I've looked at a lot of horns and drawn a lot of horns and have my own look and feel for horns. And I know what those shapes are in three-dimensional space, so I don't necessarily look at reference, though looking at some reference would have made these horns probably a lot more interesting and a lot more realistic and a lot more maybe interesting with the shapes they have. But you know, for me, it was more important to get some really good face reference. And he sure does look worried. He's the worried head. Worried head is not so sure about what fierce head's doing. But, you know, basically repeating what I did on the first head, grabbing some of the greens that are in the shadows and some of the bounced light. As you can see right there, you know, I'm curving into the form with the rim light. It's not an outline. It dances along the contours of the volume, and it curves and it cuts into, and it just helps better define the volumes in shadow. And it's really cool. Rim lighting's the best, but you got to be smart about it. You got to use it effectively. You know, it might not necessarily be completely accurate on those two heads, but that's what I did, and I'm going to stick by it. I think I got distracted from talking about how long it takes to make things, because yeah, one of my first pieces of work that I did for a board game. I did a trading card for a board game. It was one of my first color pieces as an artist in the gaming industry. Because, I mean, for the far majority, like the first 8 years of my career, I worked almost exclusively black and white. So tackling color was really hard for me. And it was a big, daunting uphill struggle. And this workflow that I have with my digital painting all stems from me learning and experimenting and making mistakes with color. And this is why I go about making these the way I do. And some of the process is to prevent me from making my bad habit-based mistakes. And some of it just makes things a lot easier. It takes some of the frustrating thought process out of making sure that I've built up the value and color structure correctly. By building the layers the way I have, all the pieces fall together kind of on their own. I know what these layers are doing, and they're put there for a particular reason. But it's because of all the mistakes I've made up until now. And ultimately, too, the sidetracked yet again, you know, these are tools. and you need to learn how the tools work and why they work. And if you do not understand why these tools work and how they work, you're not fully learning and getting the most out of these tools. Because, if you're using a pencil, you need to understand how a pencil works. It has the pointy end that you make marks with, but it's not simply holding it in your hand. It's the pressure of the point of the pencil on the paper. It's the angle. Are you painting? Are you drawing with the tip? Are you drawing with the side of the lead? Are you holding it basically in your palm and making sweeping gestures, or are you clenching it tight with your index thumb and middle finger and drawing really tight lines? It's the same way with the computer. It's the same way with a digital brush and a digital palette and digital canvas. These are tools, and you need to learn how to effectively use them. In many ways, early on, a lot of what I was doing digitally was just, looking back at it now, was painting traditionally on a digital surface. And in many ways, I wasn't taking full I wasn't getting everything, I wasn't fully using my tools. And that's where building up the gradient maps and a value layer and underpainting color layer, I'm now beginning to use these tools more effectively to get the look and feel that I want. And I've just laid down a lot more texture on that lower hand, grabbing all those tentacles, starting to put in some brighter highlights. His hand's probably been in the water. It has a nice shine on it. And he's fighting the monster, throwing some brighter color into some of those scaly spots, making him look good. But, yeah, so early on in my career, like doing a simple, like 2-inch by 2-inch painting, it took me a week or some ridiculously huge length of time. It took me days. It took me days and days and days, hours and hours and hours to do this small, little. Now looking at it years later, flat, bland, unintentionally asymmetrical. I look at the face of this creature that I did, and it's not even remotely symmetrical when it was supposed to be symmetrical. It just was all over the place and ugly, and it just all this time and energy. But I learned, and that's how it works. Live and learn, live and learn. Oh, look, a little froggy friend has joined us. I found this little guy in the garden, and I took a quick photo and thought I would come into the painting and start to incorporate him. He has a really nice a more yellow warm green, and I thought I would start to work that into some of the tentacles. Just kind of liven things up a little bit. So I'm just going in. It's more of a cool, a cool green, a yellow, rather than a redder green that I think the tentacles were originally. But yet again, the importance of reference and looking at the world around you. I can't speak highly enough of just, go out your door and look around. Hopefully you're in a place where you can see some nature and see animals and plants doing what they do best, because there's so much we can learn. If you want to design a plant, go look at how plants are made and understand those plants. You want to design a frog monster, and I've drawn plenty of frog monsters. I've looked at a lot of frogs. I've held a lot of frogs and toads in my hands, and I've taken a lot of photos of frogs and toads and chased them around the yard taking photos, and go to zoos and just sit there in the reptile house looking at frogs and toads. I love them. They look to me, they're just so cool and so neat and offer up so many monster possibilities. But it just look at the reference, just look at these things, see how they're made, understand how they're made, and then you can begin to abstract from them. Understanding something is the first step to abstraction. And if you don't understand, how can you abstract? When I was in art school, my classmates would seemingly out of the blue seem to wake up one morning and claim that they're abstract expressionist painters. And I thought to myself, you can't paint. What are you abstracting? If you don't know how to draw, if you don't know how to paint, you can't abstract. If you do not know how animals are put together and how animals work, how anatomy works, how people work, you can't begin to abstract them and to create new things. Granted, a big tentacle monster is an exception. There's octopuses, there's squid, there's snakes, but for every rule there's an exception. But for the big two-headed giant, I looked at pictures of my monster model, looked at the hands and looked at the faces, and abstracted from them and turned them into the monster that he is now. It looks like I'm going into some detail into the water. Things are coming together now. I hope you see, if you look at the entire painting, things are really beginning to start to shape up and come together. The forms have begun to slowly tighten up. I'm putting in brighter highlights, defining what's catching the light directly, what's in shadow. If things are wet, they're getting more of a shine and a sheen to them. But as I said, layer after layer after layer after layer. I can't just go in. I can't. I know, I think I'm sure there's plenty of painters who can just go in and make it happen. But for me, it's pass after pass after pass, and it's working and working and working the surface. And relatively speaking, 6 hours to 45 minutes for this isn't a lot of time. I was actually surprised it came together that quickly. I do a bad job of keeping track of how long it actually takes me to make a painting, because due to my schedule, I generally don't get to sit down in one block and spend 6 hours and 45 minutes painting this. I painted this over a couple different sittings, but I recorded the entire thing, and when I put it together, it was 6 hours and 45 minutes. And I think in a real world situation, at the end of the painting, I spend a lot more time studying it, like sitting and looking and responding to what's there to fix issues. So that adds some time to the end too. That's not taken into account in this piece. All right, let's zoom in. What's going on? Just adding more and more texture and cleaning things up, making sure that the edges are strong. As you can see with that rim lighting, I'm now going back in with an even brighter color, and I'm playing up some of the edges. As rim light is not uniform in thickness, it's not a single thick outline to anything. It curves into the forms and volumes. It also, generally speaking, has brighter points and darker points. And it's how it wraps around the form. And there's going to be that one little bit that's pointing towards the light source a little bit better. Okay, I've put away my reference. At this point, I am now just focusing on final cleanup and additional passes of texture. I'm zooming in so I can start to clean up things. At this point is when I really move in close and start really defining and cleaning up. I'm actually doing some more work on the background, just adding more here and there, just where I feel that it needs to have a little bit more impact. Start to put more wrinkles and folds and darkening things up, lightening things up. Stop me if you heard this before, but it's layer upon layer of detail and texture. Let's see, while I'm adding in all of this lovely, lovely texture and detail, a lot of folks ask me about getting work. And I'll throw this in here while we're watching me paint. How did I go about getting established with the companies I got established with, and how do you get work? And as a young artist, how do you get work? And I have a pretty much a stock image. Well, I'll stop real quick. As you can see, some of those dark areas, I'm just going in with a little bit of color and glazing over them, like that down in the neck and around the head. I'm just kind of taking the punch out of some of the darks that are a little bit too black and a little bit too intense. They'll come back, but I'm just kind of softening some of that out, putting some more color back into things, playing up the sides that are in the shadow, just giving more volume and more color. Okay, so I have a stock response for when people ask me how to get work. It's really simple and it's really hard all at the same time. For me, and I didn't necessarily do this all in the correct right order. Some of this kind of happened all out of order all over the place. But first, you need to determine what kind of work you want to make. For me, it was simple. I make monsters. I love monsters. I paint monsters. I draw monsters. I would paint and draw monsters all day and all night, no matter if I was working for a client or if I wasn't. So that's taken care of. I make monsters. And then I had to look for companies that needed monsters and needed the kind of monsters that I wanted to make. And that took a bit of exploration, a lot of investigation, and internet searches, and going to conventions and looking at product, and going to the comic book store and the gaming store and looking at what is made by, what companies are out there, what they make, who makes what. And I had to investigate those companies. And once I picked out companies that looked like might be a good fit, you look at the level and the quality of work that they're using. And you must make a decision with yourself and be honest with yourself. You need to look at your own work, and you need to make sure that the quality of your work that you're making is as good, ideally better, than the work that the companies are using. And then you submit your work, and hopefully you'll get a job. Now, most art directors that I've engaged with and worked with and know, they are very cool, very generous, very giving people. And if you want to get feedback, a simple email works really well. And you can see, find out if you're there yet, or go to as you see right now, right then, I was turning on and off the drawing layer, and you could see how much disappeared from my painting. And in the layered files that accompany this, you'll be able to see just how much is affected by the drawing. But yeah, the drawing still is important. It needs to be back there. And it is a lot of the darkest darks and the darkest darks of this painting are my drawing. And I'm still going in and adding more detail, more scales, more folds, more wrinkles, just doing my thing, doing my texture pass. I have certain things I like to do with texture, certain textures I really like, and at this point I'm just noodling, just going in and doing my thing. So what I was saying about art directors is, you know what, you don't have to necessarily wait um, to the ideal level of quality, because you know, as much as you're improving, everybody else is improving too. So you might not necessarily get to that magical level you think you need to be at. Maybe you're already there. The art director will be able to tell you. And there's plenty of clients out there, and there's plenty of jobs out there, and they're always looking for people. And don't hesitate to send your work in, but you need to expect rejection. And I've had my share of rejection, and that's just the nature of the beast. But but be realistic with yourself. You know, that's where being honest with yourself and being honest with the level of work that you produce comes into play, because you need to be objective as much as you can. And I'm still not a very objective with my own work, but you need to be able to look at your work and look at the work that is being used on any given project and figure out your place. That that are you as good as the people they're using? And if you are, then you should definitely be sending your work out there. And if you don't think your work is as good as what's being used, then you need to seek out the resources, watch the demos, and work. It takes time and it takes effort. But that's the $64 million question, is how do you get work? And you have to put in the time and the energy, unfortunately. Hopefully at this point you're just not wondering, what the heck am I rambling on about? This has nothing to do with painting or painting this piece. But hopefully it does, because it's all interconnected. Oh, putting gnarly, nasty teeth in there. There's never enough teeth in monsters, so you can go put a couple more in. Just really going back in, starting to really sharpen up edges, really, put points on things, put a really strong highlight on things that are reflective or shiny. At this point, I'm really just starting to really clean up what I've been working on. Lost a little detail out, a little texture. For me, this is some of the most fun stuff, because some of it you can be really loose with and be kind of crazy. All those little squiggles, when you zoom out, they become something much more than they are right there. It's like the little shine on all his fancy little necklace, and it just kind of, when you zoom out, it starts to become grooves in the teeth, or little shells or clay pieces that he has on his neck. And it's one of the reasons why I work zoomed out a lot of the time, is that it's about this overall image, is making sure this reads. It's not about if I have every little groove on the pieces of stuff on his necklace, but the way I've built up the file with the drawing, the value buildup with all of the crazy texture, the underpainting with all of the texture and splatter, and then going in with wave after wave after wave after wave of painting. There's just this, everywhere has been touched multiple times, and that layering of texture and all the pixels upon pixels of different colors, layering up different areas, just become that much more interesting. So then at the end, I can zoom in and just finesse edges and add little details, and it just really makes things pop and pull together. And I don't have to get in there and define each and every scale on his hand and make sure that every single edge is perfect, because yes, you can do that, but in the scheme of things, you can get away with not doing it. You can get away with a lot less, and it's still loved, and it's still worked and taken care of, and you have put the time and the energy that it needs into it. Learning how to effectively use your time and energy is really important. Yeah, and that comes from experience, which comes from hard work and time spent. Hopefully you get some repeating ideas here. And hopefully it all makes sense and it's interesting to listen to, and I'm not just rambling like a crazy person about painting. Because to me, it's like I could tell you exactly what I do every step of the way and why I'm doing it, but that's why I'm doing it. A lot of this is that you need to see how I do it and learn from it and figure out, okay, this is how he does it. What do I need to do it for me? What can I pull from this to make it work for me? Because, I mean, ultimately, if you try to do exactly what I'm doing, it's not going to be genuine for you. You need to pull from this, learn from what I'm doing, as I learned from watching other people. I learned by watching them, and I worked and worked and worked and worked and worked and found my path and my way of making a painting. Because unfortunately, you can't just copy someone's actions, because the moment by moment choices that I'm making on this painting are mine. And you need to find your moment by moment decisions and your responses to the painting, because everyone will do this differently. And I'm getting very, very close to being done here. And what I'm now doing is I've copied the entire image and I've pasted it to a new layer. And as you can see, I'm brightening the entire image. I have a problem with making my pieces a little duller than I mean to. They come out a little grayer, a little chalkier. And for the most part, I have to brighten them up. And I've had to do this so many times, I kind of just know what I need to do. And I brighten up the piece, and it just works a lot better. I also, printing out your work lets you also get a good idea of how it's going to look and a better idea what the piece really looks like, because it's no longer backlit and glowing. So I brighten everything up, and then I go in with a brand new layer on top of that, and I start one final pass of texture and detail and cleaning things up and fixing things. Because there's always going to be issues to address. I mean, no painting is ever fully finished. It's merely abandoned, or so they say. But I'm also starting to do stuff that really should be on its own layer. And just in case things go horribly, horribly wrong, it'd be nice to be able to get rid of the layer. And I'm starting to put in a lot of the dripping, glistening water sheeting off of things, and a lot of the dynamic effects. Magic would be on this layer. You're going to see a lot of spit and drool and saliva, but just in general, a lot of the water effects, the last layer of detail, the stuff that doesn't have a lot to do with the form of what you see. I mean, it's the water sheeting off of the side of the tentacle has very little to do necessarily with making sure that the volume of the tentacle is rendered. But it's all about, showing the glint of that edge of water, the spectral highlight. But, the importance, for me, the importance of these tutorials is for you to understand how I do it, so that you can learn from it and figure out how best for you to do it. And ultimately, I mean, that's a lot of the big jumps that I've made in my own ability, is sort of seeing these hurdles dealt with by other professionals and my peers and my friends. It's like, oh, that's how you deal with your value study in your work. That makes a lot more sense. Let me see if I can take what you did. I see what you've done. Let me see if I can make it work better for me. And then I go from there. And that's a lot of some of my underpainting was trial and error, talking with friends, seeing how they put together their underpainting, taking what they've done, meshing it with my own things and figuring it out. Because, I've had over the years, over the 13 years I've been working, 13, 14 years I've been working as a professional artist, I've had 10 times that many ways of going about making an image. And, it's just, though, granted, I've stuck with this way that I've been making paintings for the last 2 years, I think, or just over 2 years, or year and a half or something. So, time for some drool. Yeah. This is my favorite part of the entire painting, is putting the saliva and spit flying from the mouths of monsters. And I'm not exaggerating too much when I say that, because this stuff's fun, and really, to me, it adds a lot of movement, and it's really kind of just silly and gross and weird, and it's the kind of stuff I would love to do at the very beginning of the painting. But if I did it at the very beginning of the painting, it's wasted. It's useless. It gets painted over, or I'll be trying to paint around it the whole time. But texture, 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 detail, detail, detail. And I hope you've seen, in the last hour and 20 minutes, or however long we've been sitting here, the paintings come together in front of you, and there's no great epiphany. It was just hard work. It's work. It's layers upon layers, and it's just sticking with it and communicating with the piece. Making marks, seeing what the marks done, and how to relate to them. Unfortunately, it's not this huge. Unfortunately, it's this crazy thing that's really simple and yet really hard. And the more you do it, the easier it gets. But it also, at the same time, I get to realize just how hard and complex it is. Especially when I think about my friends that work completely traditional. I do a little bit of traditional work, but oh man, watching those guys work is amazing, and seeing the finished product is amazing. But I paint digitally. That's really cool too. But last fixes, tweaks. At this point, the painting is pretty much done. You can really see that it's come together. Just playing with some of the background, knocking things back, darkening edges, pulling some darks into the corners, giving a little bit more of a vignette, yet again to direct the eye inward. Very close now. I felt that some of the water and some of the tentacles weren't bright enough. They were a little rather dull. So I've gone in with an overlay layer on top of everything else that I've done, and I'm brushing in some color, as you saw down in the water and on the tentacles. Just punching it up a little bit. I just felt it was a little drab. And then I'm going to lower the opacity a bit so that it just adds a wash of color. Now, on a new layer, set to overlay, I'm going to add my last layer of texture. And I get my big, crazy, splattery texture brush, and I pick a very bright red and a very bright white green. Both, they're not white, they have a little bit of color to them, and they're not fully desaturated, and they're not fully bright. And as you can see, it's set to overlay, so it really makes the highlights pop, and it just kind of brightens up everything and adds a little bit of noise. And that's the last little bit I do, and I usually lower it down to about a 30% opacity. Now I've turned it off, and I'm actually going back in with some more detail. I thought there should be some more flying droplets of water. A little bit more action. It's on its own layer with the rest of the crazy detail. But we've got the drawing, working it all the way up. Boom. So there you have it. From drawing to finished painting in about 6 hours and 45 minutes of painting time. And I hope you enjoyed this walkthrough. I hope it was informative and not too rambling and weird. All right, thank you very much. Again, this was Christopher Burdett, and I was making a pair of battling monsters in a complementary color scheme of red and green. Thank you very much.